In the narrow streets of 17th century Amsterdam, a young Jewish merchant's son was about to commit an act so radical, so dangerous to religious authority, that it would get him expelled from his community, cursed by his own people, and condemned by nearly every religious institution in Europe. This wasn't a violent crime or a political betrayal. This was the quiet, methodical work of a philosopher who dared to suggest something that seemed unthinkable: that God and nature were one and the same, that the universe operated by necessity rather than divine whim, that true freedom came not from obeying religious commandments, but from understanding the rational structure of reality itself. His name was Baruch Spinoza, though the world would come to know him as Benedict. He'd be called the most dangerous man in Europe, accused of atheism by Christians and Jews alike, his books banned, his ideas considered so threatening that merely owning his writings could bring persecution. Yet this quiet lens grinder, working in solitude after his excommunication, would produce a vision of reality so comprehensive, so logically rigorous, and so psychologically liberating that philosophers are still grappling with its implications today. If you're enjoying these explorations, I'd love it if you could hit that like button, or maybe even subscribe. It genuinely helps more than you'd think. I'm always curious about where you're tuning in from, so drop a comment letting me know what city you're in and what time it is there right now. I love seeing our community connecting from all corners of the world through these philosophical journeys. Now, get comfortable. Maybe dim those lights. Turn on a fan for some gentle background noise, and let's settle into tonight's exploration together. We're going to discover why Spinoza's ideas were considered so dangerous that they had to be suppressed, and why his vision of God, freedom, and human nature might be even more relevant today than when he first conceived it. Part 1. The Excommunication. Amsterdam in the 1650s was one of the most tolerant cities in Europe, a haven for religious refugees and free thinkers. The Portuguese Jewish community that had settled there after fleeing the Inquisition in Spain and Portugal had built a prosperous, tightly knit society. They'd established synagogues, schools, and businesses. They'd created a little piece of their lost homeland in the tolerant Dutch Republic. Into this community, on November 24th, 1632, Baruch Spinoza was born. His father, Michael, was a successful merchant dealing in dried fruits and other goods from the Portuguese trade networks. The family was respected, moderately wealthy, part of the established Jewish community that had found safety and opportunity in Amsterdam's commercial environment. Young Baruch was bright, unusually so. He excelled in his studies at the Talmud Torah school, learning Hebrew, studying the Torah, the Talmud, and the commentaries of medieval Jewish philosophers like Maimonides and Gersonides. He seemed destined for a role as a religious scholar or community leader. His teachers recognized his exceptional intellectual gifts and invested in his education. But something was happening beneath the surface. Spinoza was reading widely, not just traditional Jewish texts, but also Christian philosophy, the new science of Galileo and Descartes, Latin literature, and the radical political ideas circulating in Amsterdam's intellectual circles. He was learning Latin from a freethinker named Franciscus van den Enden, who ran a school that attracted students interested in the new philosophy and science that was transforming European thought. Van den Enden's school was more than just a Latin academy. It was a gathering place for radical thinkers, people questioning traditional authority in religion, politics, and philosophy. Here, Spinoza encountered ideas that'd profoundly shape his thinking. That the Bible could be studied as a historical document rather than divine revelation. That political authority derived from the consent of the governed rather than divine right. That reason, rather than tradition, should guide human understanding. The questions that had always been present in Jewish theology, the tensions between reason and revelation, between philosophy and faith, between the literal reading of Scripture and allegorical interpretation, these questions were becoming urgent for the young Spinoza. He couldn't simply accept traditional answers when reason suggested different conclusions. The Jewish philosophical tradition itself contained these tensions. Maimonides, the great medieval philosopher, had worked to reconcile Aristotelian philosophy with Torah. But his reconciliation required extensive allegorical interpretation of Scripture, reading philosophical doctrines into texts that didn't obviously contain them. This approach satisfied some, but troubled others, who wondered whether it was honest interpretation or forced harmonization. Spinoza was reading these medieval Jewish philosophers carefully. He understood their arguments, appreciated their intellectual sophistication, but ultimately found their reconciliation attempts unconvincing. When reason and revelation conflicted, when philosophical demonstration led to conclusions contradicting scriptural teaching, which should yield? The traditional answer was that reason must submit to revelation. Spinoza was moving toward the opposite conclusion. By his early 20s, Spinoza had begun expressing doubts that alarmed the community elders. He questioned whether the soul was immortal in the way traditional teaching claimed. He suggested that angels might be imaginative projections rather than real beings. He wondered whether God truly had the human-like personality and emotions described in Scripture. He questioned whether the Torah had been written by Moses or was instead a compilation by later authors. These weren't casual doubts expressed in private conversation. Spinoza was developing systematic philosophical arguments that challenged fundamental doctrines. And in a community that had suffered centuries of persecution for its faith, that depended on religious unity for its survival in a Christian society, such questioning was intolerable. The Portuguese Jewish community in Amsterdam existed in a precarious position. They'd been granted toleration by the Dutch authorities, allowed to practice their religion and conduct their business. But this toleration was conditional, dependent on maintaining good order and not causing scandal. If members of the community openly challenged religious authority or expressed heretical views, it could provoke Dutch authorities to revoke their privileges. Moreover, the community had just emerged from the trauma of the Inquisition. Many members had family histories of forced conversion, secret Jewish practice, persecution, and martyrdom. Their Judaism had been maintained at tremendous cost. The idea that someone would voluntarily question and reject Jewish teaching seemed not just wrong, but incomprehensible, almost a betrayal of all that previous generations had suffered to preserve. The community leaders tried to bring Spinoza back into line. They offered him money, a substantial annual pension of 1,000 florins, if he'd simply keep his opinions to himself and maintain outward conformity. This wasn't unusual. The community had made similar arrangements with other intellectuals whose private beliefs diverged from orthodoxy. They didn't require genuine belief, just public conformity and discretion. They threatened him with excommunication if he continued expressing heretical views. They tried persuasion, then bribery, then intimidation. Some sources suggest there was even an assassination attempt, a knife attack that Spinoza survived, though the historical evidence for this is uncertain. Spinoza refused to be silent. He couldn't betray what his reason showed him to be true, couldn't pretend to believe what he'd concluded was false. His integrity wouldn't allow compromise on matters of truth. The money didn't tempt him. He'd chosen to live simply, supporting himself through lens grinding rather than depending on communal support that would have come with expectations of conformity. On July 27, 1656, the 23-year-old Spinoza was summoned before the Ma'amad, the governing council of the Portuguese Jewish community. The Sherem, the decree of excommunication, was read in Portuguese and Hebrew. Its language was extraordinarily harsh, more severe than typical excommunications. The lords of the Ma'amad, having long known of the evil opinions and acts of Baruch Spinoza, have endeavored by various means and promises to turn him from his evil ways. But having failed to make him mend his wicked ways, and on the contrary, daily receiving more and more serious information about the abominable heresies which he practiced and taught, and about his monstrous deeds, and having for this numerous trustworthy witnesses who've reported and testified on all this in the presence of the said Spinoza, they've decided, with the consent of the Honorable Chachamin, that the said Spinoza should be excommunicated and expelled from the people of Israel. The cherem continued with curses drawn from Deuteronomy, invoking every malediction the tradition could summon. Cursed be he by day, and cursed be he by night. Cursed be he when he lies down, and cursed be he when he rises up. Cursed be he when he goes out, and cursed be he when he comes in. The Lord will not spare him, but the anger of the Lord and his jealousy shall smoke against that man, and all the curses that are written in this book shall lie upon him, and the Lord shall blot out his name from under heaven. The decree forbade all members of the Jewish community from communicating with Spinoza, from reading anything he wrote, from conducting business with him, from coming within 4 cubits of him, from sheltering him or speaking with him. He was cut off completely, cast out from the only community he'd ever known, declared dead to his people. We don't know exactly what Spinoza had said or taught that provoked such extreme measures. The specific charges weren't recorded, only the vague references to evil opinions, abominable heresies, and monstrous deeds. Some scholars suggest he'd been teaching that God had a body, that the soul died with the body, that the Torah wasn't divinely given. Others think he'd been expressing the philosophical positions that would later appear in his Ethics, ideas that seemed to dissolve traditional religion into a naturalistic philosophy. What we do know is Spinoza's response. He didn't recant. He didn't beg for forgiveness. He didn't try to argue his way back into the community. Instead, he wrote a defense of his position, the Apologia, which unfortunately hasn't survived. According to reports, it was so uncompromising, so unapologetic, that it convinced the community leaders they'd made the right decision. In this lost defense, Spinoza apparently argued that he'd done nothing wrong, that he was simply following reason where it led, that his conclusions were based on careful philosophical argument rather than malice or impiety. He rejected the authority of the rabbis to dictate what he must believe, asserting that truth could be discovered through reason alone and didn't require religious authority. This was the ultimate challenge to religious authority. The claim that individual reason trumped communal tradition, that philosophical demonstration superseded scriptural revelation, that each person had the right and responsibility to think for themselves rather than accepting inherited beliefs on authority. Spinoza left Amsterdam, changed his name from the Hebrew Baruch to the Latin Benedict, both meaning blessed, and began the solitary life that had characterized his remaining years. He'd earn his living grinding lenses for microscopes and telescopes, a skilled craft that allowed independence while leaving time for philosophical work. He'd live simply, almost ascetically, in rented rooms in small Dutch towns, writing the philosophical works that had eventually transformed European thought. The lens grinding was meticulous work requiring precision and patience. Spinoza became skilled at it, producing high-quality lenses sought by scientists and instrument makers. The work had a meditative quality, the repetitive motions allowing his mind to work on philosophical problems while his hands shaped glass. But it also had health consequences. The fine glass dust damaged his lungs over years of daily exposure. He moved first to Rijnsburg, a small village near Leiden, renting a room from a Mennonite family. Later, he'd moved to Voorburg and finally to The Hague, always living simply, always maintaining his independence through his craft. His landlords and neighbors generally liked him, finding him quiet, courteous, easy to live with, despite his notorious ideas. The excommunication was a pivotal moment, not just biographically, but philosophically. It forced Spinoza to think through his relationship to tradition, to authority, to revealed religion. It made him confront the question of how to live when cast out from community, how to find meaning and purpose outside inherited frameworks. It gave him the freedom to develop his ideas without the constraints of communal conformity or the need to reconcile his philosophy with religious orthodoxy. In some ways, the excommunication liberated Spinoza. He was free to follow reason wherever it led, unbound by the need to maintain community standing or preserve relationships with those who'd reject his conclusions. He could write with complete honesty, developing a philosophical system that recognized no authority beyond rational demonstration. But it also isolated him. For the rest of his life, Spinoza'd live on the margins of society, never fully belonging anywhere, always suspect to religious authorities, always dangerous to conventional piety. His books would be published anonymously or posthumously. His ideas would be whispered about, condemned, suppressed. He'd die young, at 44, his health broken partly by the dust from lens grinding, partly perhaps from the stress of living always as an outcast. Yet from this isolation would emerge one of the most systematic, comprehensive, and radical philosophical visions ever conceived. The young man, cast out by his community, would construct an entire worldview based solely on reason, a vision of God, nature, mind, and freedom that had challenged everything traditional religion taught and offer an alternative path to human flourishing based on understanding rather than faith. His small circle of friends and correspondents would become his intellectual community. He'd exchange letters with the finest scientific and philosophical minds of his age. Henry Oldenburg, secretary of the Royal Society in London, Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, the great German philosopher and mathematician, Christian Huygens, the brilliant Dutch physicist and astronomer. These exchanges show Spinoza engaging seriously with contemporary science and philosophy while developing his own distinctive system. Part 2. The geometric method and the nature of substance. When Spinoza sat down to write his masterwork, the Ethics, he made a decision that still strikes readers as strange. He'd present his philosophy not as a narrative argument, not as a dialogue, not as a series of essays, but in the style of Euclidean geometry. Definitions, axioms, propositions, demonstrations, corollaries, scholiums, like a mathematical treatise, proving theorems about triangles and circles. This wasn't just stylistic preference. It reflected Spinoza's deepest conviction about the nature of reality and knowledge. Just as geometric truths follow necessarily from basic definitions and axioms, just as the properties of triangles couldn't be otherwise given what triangles are, so too, the structure of reality follows necessarily from the nature of substance. Everything that exists by necessity. Everything that happens by necessity. And this necessity can be understood through reason alone. The geometric method had been used before in philosophy, notably by Descartes in his replies to objections. But Spinoza employed it more systematically and rigorously than anyone before him. He wasn't just presenting philosophical arguments in geometric form for rhetorical effect. He genuinely believed that philosophical truth could be demonstrated with the same certainty as mathematical truth. The Ethics begins with 8 definitions. Spinoza defines what he means by cause of itself, finite in its own kind, substance, attribute, mode, God, freedom, and eternity. These aren't arbitrary stipulations, but careful attempts to capture the essential nature of the things he's discussing. Each definition isolates what's fundamental to the concept, stripping away accidental features to reach the core meaning. Then he states 7 axioms, self-evident truths that require no proof, that everything's either in itself or in another, that what can't be conceived through another must be conceived through itself, that from a given determinate cause, an effect necessarily follows, that knowledge of an effect depends on and involves knowledge of the cause, and so on. These axioms establish the basic logical framework within which the demonstrations will proceed. From these definitions and axioms, Spinoza derives propositions through rigorous logical demonstration. Each proposition is proven by reference to previous propositions, definitions, and axioms. The structure builds systematically, each conclusion depending on what's been established before, creating an interconnected web of demonstrated truths. The first and most fundamental proposition is that substance is prior to its modifications. This seems abstract, almost trivial, but it contains the seed of everything that follows. A substance is that which exists in itself and is conceived through itself. It doesn't depend on anything else for its existence or its conception. A mode, in contrast, is a modification of substance, something that exists in another and is conceived through another. Think of it this way. A wave exists as a modification of water. The wave isn't a separate thing that could exist independently. It's water in a particular form. The water is the substance. The wave is a mode. You can't understand what a wave is without understanding water, but you can understand water without knowing about waves. Now here's where it gets radical. Spinoza argues that there can be only one substance. Why? Because if there were 2 substances, they'd have to be distinguished either by their attributes, their essential properties, or by their modes, their modifications. But if they're distinguished by their attributes, then they're completely different in nature, with nothing in common. And if 2 things have nothing in common, one can't cause or affect the other. They'd be completely independent. But if 2 supposed substances shared the same attribute, the same essential nature, then they wouldn't really be 2 substances at all. they'd be the same substance appearing in different modifications. It's like saying two waves are two different waters. No, they're the same water in different forms. Therefore, there can be only one substance. And this one substance must be infinite, because anything finite would be limited by something else of the same nature, which would contradict the uniqueness of substance. And this infinite substance must have infinite attributes, infinite ways of being understood, because anything that can exist must be contained in substance, must be expressible through one of substance's attributes. The argument is elegant but dense. Spinoza's claiming that the very concept of substance, properly understood, leads necessarily to the conclusion that only one substance exists. Multiple substances are conceptually incoherent. The apparent multiplicity we experience in the world isn't multiplicity of substances, but multiplicity of modes, different modifications of the one substance. Then comes the move that would get Spinoza condemned as an atheist by nearly everyone. This infinite substance is God, or rather, God and nature are the same thing. Deus sive natura, God or nature, Spinoza's famous formulation that had shocked religious sensibilities for centuries. By God, Spinoza means a being absolutely infinite, that is, substance consisting of infinite attributes, each of which expresses eternal and infinite essence. This God necessarily exists because existence belongs to the nature of substance. A substance that didn't exist would be a contradiction, like a triangle that didn't have three sides. This wasn't atheism in Spinoza's view. He was claiming that God necessarily exists, that God is the infinite, eternal substance underlying all reality. But this God is nothing like the God of traditional religion. Spinoza's God doesn't think, doesn't plan, doesn't create by choice, doesn't respond to prayers, doesn't perform miracles, doesn't reward or punish, doesn't have purposes or goals. Spinoza's God is the totality of nature itself, operating according to its own necessary rational structure. Everything that exists is a modification of God, a way that the infinite substance expresses itself. You, me, stars, stones, thoughts, emotions, all of it, modifications of the one infinite substance expressing itself in infinite ways. The traditional religious view holds that God created the world by free choice, that things could have been otherwise if God had chosen differently. Spinoza rejects this completely. Everything follows from God's nature with the same necessity that geometric truths follow from definitions. God couldn't have created a different universe any more than triangles could have different angle sums. The nature of infinite substance necessarily produces this universe, this totality of modifications. In Proposition 16, Spinoza demonstrates this necessity. From the necessity of the divine nature, there must follow infinitely many things in infinitely many ways. Everything that can exist must exist because it follows necessarily from God's infinite nature. The actual universe exhausts all possibility. Nothing that could exist fails to exist. This has staggering implications. It means there's no contingency in nature, nothing that happens by chance or could have been otherwise. Everything that exists necessarily. Everything that happens necessarily. The entire universe is a vast deterministic system where every event flows necessarily from prior causes according to rational laws. It means God isn't a person, isn't a conscious being making decisions. God is the impersonal totality of nature, the infinite substance expressing itself in infinite modifications. When we understand nature, we understand God. When we understand the rational necessity governing natural processes, we understand divine necessity. It means there's no supernatural realm separate from nature. Everything is natural. Everything is part of the one substance. Miracles are impossible because they'd violate the necessary laws flowing from God's nature. Special divine intervention is incoherent because it'd mean God acting against God's own nature. It means traditional religious worship based on hope and fear, petitionary prayer, sacrifice, bargaining with God. All of it is based on fundamental misunderstanding. You can't bargain with necessary rational structure. You can't change what must necessarily be. You can't hope for divine favor when everything happens by necessity. The proper relationship to God, Spinoza argues, isn't worship, fear, or obedience, but intellectual love. We should seek to understand God's nature, which means understanding nature's rational structure. This understanding itself is the highest human good, the source of genuine joy and peace. Spinoza distinguishes between natura naturans, naturing nature, and natura naturata, natured nature. Natura naturans is substance considered as the active, productive principle, God as the source from which everything flows. Natura naturata is the totality of modes, everything that follows from God's nature, the universe of particular things and events. This distinction helps clarify his position. When he says God and nature are identical, he doesn't mean God is simply the collection of natural things. God is the active principle, the infinite substance expressing itself through infinite modes. The modes are God's self-expression, but God transcends any particular mode or collection of modes. The geometric method serves Spinoza's purpose perfectly because it demonstrates necessity. When you follow a geometric proof, you see that the conclusion must follow from the premises. You see that it couldn't be otherwise. This is exactly what Spinoza wants to show about reality itself, that everything follows necessarily from the nature of infinite substance, that the universe couldn't be otherwise. That rational understanding reveals this necessity. Critics complain that the geometric method is dry, that it lacks the warmth and accessibility of other philosophical styles. But Spinoza deliberately chose this austere method precisely because he wanted to avoid relying on rhetorical persuasion or emotional appeal. He wanted to demonstrate truth through pure reason, to show rather than persuade, to make his conclusions as certain as mathematical theorems. Reading the Ethics requires patience and careful attention. You can't skim it or read it casually. Each proposition builds on what came before. Each demonstration requires following the logical steps. But for those willing to do the work, the experience is powerful. You're not being persuaded. You're being shown. You're following necessary connections, seeing how conclusions flow inevitably from premises. The substance monism, the claim that there's only one substance and it's identical with God and nature, forms the foundation of Spinoza's entire system. Everything else follows from this. His account of mind and body, his theory of the emotions, his ethics, his politics, his understanding of freedom, all of it builds on this metaphysical foundation. This radical monism challenges our ordinary experience of a world containing many separate things. We perceive trees, rocks, people, thoughts as distinct entities. Spinoza says this perception is superficial. At the deepest level, there's only one substance, one reality, expressing itself through infinite modifications. The apparent multiplicity is real at the level of modes, but conceals underlying unity at the level of substance. Part 3. Mind and body in the one substance. One of the most perplexing problems in philosophy is the mind-body problem. How can mind and matter interact? How can immaterial thoughts cause physical actions? How can physical brain processes produce conscious experience? This problem tormented Descartes, Spinoza's predecessor, who proposed that mind and body were two completely different kinds of substance that somehow interacted in the pineal gland. Spinoza thought Descartes' solution was hopeless. If mind and body are completely different in nature, having nothing in common, then they can't interact. Causation requires some commonality, some shared nature between cause and effect. Completely heterogeneous things can't affect each other. It's like trying to explain how numbers could cause colors, or how thoughts could push physical objects. The categories are fundamentally incompatible. But Spinoza's substance monism provides a completely different framework for understanding the relationship between mind and body. There aren't two substances, mental and physical. There's one substance, God or nature, expressing itself through infinite attributes. Two of these attributes that we know are extension, the physical realm, and thought, the mental realm. These aren't separate substances, but different aspects of the same substance. It's like how the same book can be understood as a physical object, a certain weight and size of paper and ink, and as meaningful content, ideas and arguments. These aren't two different things somehow mysteriously interacting, but two ways of conceiving the same thing. An attribute, in Spinoza's technical terminology, is what the intellect perceives as constituting the essence of substance. Extension and thought are two ways that infinite substance manifests its essential nature. Extension is the attribute through which substance is understood as spatially extended, occupying space, divisible into parts. Thought is the attribute through which substance is understood as thinking, having ideas, being conscious. Now here's the crucial move. The order and connection of ideas is the same as the order and connection of things. Mental events and physical events don't cause each other. They're the same events understood through different attributes. Every physical state has a corresponding mental state, and vice versa. They're parallel expressions of the same underlying modification of substance. Think of it like this. A circle can be described geometrically, all points equidistant from a center, or algebraically, x2 plus y2 are 2. These are different descriptions, using different conceptual frameworks, but they describe the same thing. Changes in the geometric description correspond exactly to changes in the algebraic description, not because one causes the other, but because they're different ways of representing the same reality. Similarly, mind and body are different ways of understanding the same individual thing. Your decision to raise your arm and the neural activity and muscle contraction are the same event, one conceived through the attribute of thought, the other through extension. They don't interact, they're identical, just understood through different attributes. This theory, called psychophysical parallelism, solves the interaction problem by denying interaction. There's no mysterious causation crossing between completely different realms because there aren't two realms. There's one substance with multiple attributes, and the order and connection in each attribute mirrors the order and connection in every other. Spinoza states this explicitly in Proposition 7 of Part 2. The order and connection of ideas is the same as the order and connection of things. This is one of the most important claims in his entire system. It means that for every physical event, there's a corresponding mental event, and vice versa. The two orders run perfectly parallel, not because one causes the other, but because they're the same order conceived through different attributes. But this raises a question. If mind and body are the same thing understood differently, what exactly is this thing? What am I? Spinoza's answer: you're a finite mode of infinite substance, a particular modification of God or nature. Your mind is your body conceived through the attribute of thought. Your body is your mind conceived through the attribute of extension. More specifically, the human mind is the idea of the human body. This is Proposition 13 of Part 2. The object of the idea constituting the human mind is the body. The mind doesn't inhabit the body like a ghost in a machine. The mind is the body's idea of itself, the body conceived through thought rather than extension. This has radical implications for how we understand ourselves. Traditional dualism suggests we're essentially minds that happen to inhabit bodies, that our real self is the mental substance. Spinoza rejects this. We're not minds with bodies, or bodies with minds. We're psychophysical individuals, beings who are simultaneously mental and physical, because we're modifications of a substance that's simultaneously mental and physical through its different attributes. This means we can't privilege mind over body or body over mind. Both are equally real, equally essential to what we are. The proper goal isn't to escape the body through pure mental activity, nor to reduce everything to physical processes. It's to understand ourselves as psychophysical wholes, recognizing that mental and physical aspects are inseparable expressions of our being. It also means genuine self-knowledge requires understanding both mental and physical aspects of our nature. Understanding my ideas isn't sufficient if I don't understand the physical processes that are their parallel expression. Understanding my body isn't sufficient if I don't understand the mental states that are its parallel expression. Complete self-knowledge integrates both perspectives. Spinoza's theory of mind has another striking feature. The mind is the idea of the body. What this means is that consciousness is fundamentally self-awareness of our bodily state. We're conscious because our minds are ideas of our bodies, and ideas of ideas are consciousness of consciousness. In Proposition 19 of Part 2, Spinoza argues, the human mind doesn't know the human body and doesn't know that it exists except through ideas of the affections by which the body is affected. We know ourselves primarily through awareness of how our bodies are being affected by other things. Consciousness is rooted in bodily awareness. The more complex and differentiated our bodies, the more complex and capable our minds. A simple organism with a simple body has a simple mind. A complex organism like a human, with a highly differentiated body capable of being affected in countless ways, has a complex mind capable of complex ideas. This provides a naturalistic account of degrees of consciousness. We're not radically different in kind from other living things, just different in degree based on bodily complexity. A tree has a mind, the idea of the tree's body, but it's a much simpler mind than a human's because the tree's body is less complex and differentiated. This fits with Spinoza's overall naturalism, his insistence that humans are part of nature, subject to the same laws, not special creations elevated above the natural order. It also suggests that improving our minds requires attending to our bodies. If mind is idea of body, then bodily health, complexity, and capacity directly affect mental capability. This isn't crude materialism that reduces mind to body, but recognition that mind and body are inseparable aspects of our being. The parallelism doctrine also shapes Spinoza's understanding of causation. Physical events are caused by physical events. Mental events are caused by mental events. There's no causal interaction between the two orders, because they're the same order, conceived through different attributes. Physical causes are adequate to explain all physical events. Mental causes are adequate to explain all mental events. This means we can study mind and body as autonomous systems, each with its own causal principles, while recognizing they're ultimately the same system understood differently. Psychology doesn't need to reference brain states to explain mental causation. Neuroscience doesn't need to reference thoughts to explain neural causation. Each attribute has its own complete causal story, yet they're perfectly coordinated because they're expressions of the same substance. Every thought corresponds to a brain state. Every brain state corresponds to a thought, not because one causes the other, but because they're the same modification of substance conceived through different attributes. This elegant solution to the mind-body problem reflects Spinoza's broader philosophical strategy. Solve apparent dualities and conflicts by showing their different aspects of an underlying unity. Mind and body aren't two things, but one thing understood two ways. This same strategy applies to his treatment of freedom and necessity, reason and emotion, ethics and nature. The implications of this theory continue to unfold as Spinoza develops his system. If mind and body are parallel expressions of the same thing, then there's no immortal soul that survives bodily death. When the body dies, the mind, being the idea of that body, ceases to have its current form. This doesn't mean complete annihilation, but it rules out personal survival in any conventional sense. However, Spinoza will argue later that part of the mind is eternal. The adequate ideas we form, the rational and intuitive knowledge we achieve, these are eternal truths that participate in God's infinite intellect. To the extent we consist of eternal truths, rather than temporary bodily awareness, to that extent, we're eternal. But this is very different from the personal immortality promised by traditional religion. Part 4. The Emotions and Human Bondage. After establishing his metaphysics and theory of mind, Spinoza turns to what might seem an unlikely topic for geometric demonstration: human emotions. But if the universe is a rational system operating by necessity, if humans are finite modes of infinite substance subject to the same laws as everything else, then emotions must be part of this rational structure, explicable through the same geometric method. Part 3 of the Ethics, titled On the Origin and Nature of the Emotions, begins with a striking claim. Most writers treat human emotions and actions as if they were outside nature, as if humans were a dominion within a dominion, exempt from natural laws. They treat human vice and folly as violations of nature rather than as natural phenomena to be understood like weather or disease. Spinoza rejects this completely. Humans are part of nature, subject to the same necessity as everything else. Our emotions, desires, and actions follow necessarily from prior causes according to natural laws. Nothing about human psychology is supernatural, miraculous, or exempt from rational explanation. This doesn't mean Spinoza denies the reality or importance of emotions. Far from it. He's going to provide an incredibly detailed, psychologically penetrating analysis of emotional life. But he's going to treat emotions as natural phenomena, as modifications of our being that follow deterministic laws that can be understood and to some extent managed through rational comprehension. Spinoza defines emotion, or affect, as affections of the body by which the body's power of activity is increased or diminished, aided or constrained, and at the same time, the ideas of these affections. Every emotion involves both a bodily change, conceived through extension, and an idea of that change, conceived through thought. The psychophysical parallelism applies to emotions just as to everything else. When we experience an emotion, there's a physical change in our body and a corresponding mental change in our mind. These aren't separate events with one causing the other. They're the same event understood through different attributes. He identifies three primary emotions from which all others derive: desire, joy, and sadness. Desire, cupiditas, is our essential striving to persist in our being, what Spinoza calls conatus. Every finite thing strives to maintain and enhance its existence. This striving is the very essence of each thing, the fundamental drive underlying all activity. In Proposition 6 of Part 3, Spinoza states, "Each thing, insofar as it's in itself, strives to persevere in its being." This is the foundational claim of his psychology. Everything seeks to maintain and enhance its existence. This isn't a conscious choice or deliberate decision. It's the fundamental nature of finite modes. To exist is to strive to continue existing. Joy, Letitia, is the passage from lesser to greater perfection, from lesser to greater power of acting. When we experience joy, our power of activity is enhanced. Our ability to affect and be affected in ways that maintain our being is increased. Sadness, tristitia, is the opposite. The passage from greater to lesser perfection, the diminishment of our power of acting. All other emotions are variations and combinations of these three. Love is joy, accompanied by the idea of an external cause. We love what we believe enhances our power. Hate is sadness, accompanied by the idea of an external cause. We hate what we believe diminishes our power. Hope is inconstant joy, arising from the idea of something future or past about whose outcome we're in doubt. Fear is in constant sadness, arising from the idea of something doubtful. Spinoza catalogs dozens of emotions in detailed definitions: pride, humility, repentance, honor, shame, pity, envy, gratitude, indignation, overestimation, contempt, and many more. Each is precisely defined in terms of the primary emotions and the ideas accompanying them. This might seem like dry classification, but it's actually profound psychological analysis. Spinoza's showing that the incredibly complex emotional life humans experience can be understood as variations of a simple structure, the modification of our power of acting, together with ideas about what's affecting us. He's also showing that emotions follow rational patterns. They're not random, arbitrary, or mysterious. They flow necessarily from our nature as finite modes striving to persist in being. Understanding these patterns gives us leverage for managing our emotional life. Consider envy. Spinoza defines it as sadness at another's good fortune, combined with joy at their misfortune. Why would we experience this? Because we imagine that another's good fortune diminishes our own prospects, threatens our power. The emotion flows necessarily from our striving to enhance our being, combined with inadequate ideas about how others' success affects us. Or consider repentance. It's sadness at something we've done, accompanied by the idea that we freely chose to do it. Spinoza argues this is a harmful emotion based on confused thinking. If we truly understand that our actions were determined by causes, that we couldn't have acted otherwise given our nature and circumstances, repentance becomes irrational. Better to learn from past actions than to torture ourselves with regret over what we imagine we could have chosen differently. But here's the problem. Because we're finite, because we're parts of nature affected by countless other parts, our power of acting is constantly being modified by external causes. Things happen to us that increase or diminish our power. And because our ideas are often inadequate, confused, based on imagination rather than reason, we respond emotionally in ways that further diminish our power. This is what Spinoza calls human bondage, being driven by emotions that arise from inadequate ideas, being pushed around by external causes, having our power of acting diminished because we don't understand what's truly affecting us or what would truly benefit us. Most people live in this state of bondage. They desire things that don't actually enhance their power because they have inadequate ideas about what's good for them. They're joyful about things that ultimately diminish them. They're sad about things that don't actually harm them. They love what harms them. They hate what benefits them. All because their emotional responses are based on confused, inadequate understanding of their true nature and genuine good. The passions, emotions that arise from inadequate ideas and external causes dominate human life. We're tossed about by conflicting desires, fleeting joys that turn to sadness, fears and hopes about uncertain futures, loves and hates based on confused understanding. We're like the ocean, Spinoza suggests, driven by contrary winds, knowing not our outcome. Part 3 contains detailed analysis of how emotions generate other emotions, how they spread and intensify, how they can trap us in destructive patterns. For instance, Spinoza explains how hatred breeds more hatred through the mechanism of imitation of effects. When we see someone hating something, we tend to develop similar hatred, even without independent reason. Emotions are contagious. He also explains vacillation of mind, how we can simultaneously love and hate the same thing, experiencing conflicting emotions that paralyze us. This happens when something affects us in multiple ways, some enhancing and some diminishing our power. The resulting emotional conflict creates instability and suffering. This bondage isn't moral failing in the traditional sense. It's natural necessity. Given our finite nature, given our limited power, given our immersion in a causal network of countless other finite modes, we're necessarily subject to emotions arising from external causes. We can't escape being affected by things outside ourselves. We can't avoid having our power modified by circumstances. But we're not completely helpless. And this is where Spinoza's ethics becomes genuinely empowering. While we can't escape being affected by emotions, we can change the nature and extent of our emotional life through understanding. We can move from passive emotions based on inadequate ideas to active emotions based on adequate understanding. The key is developing adequate ideas. When we understand things through reason, when we grasp them through their causes, when we see them as necessary expressions of God or nature, our emotional response changes. We're no longer passive, merely reacting to what happens to us. We become active, understanding what's happening and why it's necessary. Consider grief at someone's death. If we have only inadequate ideas, if we think of death as arbitrary, as something that shouldn't have happened, as a violation of how things should be, we experience profound sadness that diminishes our power. But if we understand death adequately, if we recognize it as a necessary transformation of a finite mode, if we grasp it as part of the eternal necessity of nature, our response changes. This doesn't mean we don't feel loss or miss the person, but the quality of the emotion changes. It becomes less overwhelming, less diminishing of our power. We can grieve while also understanding, and this understanding moderates the sadness, preventing it from completely overwhelming our capacity to act and think. Spinoza's not advocating emotional suppression or stoic indifference. He's describing emotional transformation through understanding. The person who understands adequately still has emotions, but they're different emotions, active rather than passive, enhancing rather than diminishing power. This analysis of emotions reveals Spinoza's profound psychological insight. He recognizes that emotions follow patterns, that they're responses to ideas about what's affecting us, that changing our ideas changes our emotional life. This anticipates modern cognitive approaches to emotion that emphasize how our interpretations and beliefs shape our emotional responses. But it also reveals his commitment to naturalism and determinism. Emotions aren't free choices or moral failings. They're necessary responses arising from our nature as finite modes interacting with other finite modes. Understanding this necessity is the first step toward achieving the kind of freedom that's actually possible for beings like us. In the appendix to Part 3, Spinoza provides definitions of 48 emotions, a systematic taxonomy of human affective life. This catalog demonstrates the comprehensiveness of his psychological analysis. Every nuance of emotional experience can be understood through the basic framework he's established. The transition from Part 3 to Part 4, from the analysis of emotions to the question of human freedom, represents a pivotal moment in the ethics. Having shown how emotions arise necessarily and often trap us in bondage, Spinoza must now explain how liberation is possible within this deterministic framework. Part 5. True Freedom and the Intellectual Love of God. Part 5 of the Ethics, titled On the Power of the Intellect or on Human Freedom, addresses what seems like a paradox. If everything happens by necessity, if human actions are determined by prior causes, if we're finite modes subject to natural laws, how can there be any freedom at all? Spinoza's answer revolutionizes how we think about freedom. He rejects the traditional notion of free will, the idea that we could have chosen otherwise, that our decisions aren't determined by prior causes. This kind of freedom is incoherent in Spinoza's view, a confusion based on ignorance of the causes determining our choices. When we think we're freely choosing, we're simply unaware of the causes that are determining our choice. We experience the decision, but don't perceive its causes, so we imagine it's free. It's like thinking the stone, if it were conscious, would believe it's freely choosing to fall when actually gravity's determining its motion. This is the famous example Spinoza uses in a letter to Schuller. If a stone in motion were conscious, it would think it was freely choosing to move because it would experience its motion but not perceive the causes producing it. True freedom, Spinoza argues, isn't freedom from causation or necessity. It's freedom from external compulsion, the state of acting from our own nature rather than being passively determined by external causes. A thing is free when it acts solely from the necessity of its own nature. A thing is enslaved when it's determined by external causes. God is absolutely free in this sense because God acts solely from divine nature, determined by nothing external. Everything God does flows necessarily from what God is. There's nothing outside God that could compel or constrain divine activity. God is completely self-determined, expressing infinite nature through infinite modifications. Finite modes can never be absolutely free because we're necessarily affected by external causes. We're parts of nature, and other parts necessarily affect us. But we can be more or less free depending on how much our actions flow from adequate understanding of our own nature versus being determined by confused ideas and external forces. The path to freedom is through knowledge, specifically 3 kinds of knowledge Spinoza distinguishes. The first kind is imagination, imaginatio, knowledge from random experience and hearsay. This includes all the confused, inadequate knowledge we acquire through ordinary sensory experience and social learning. It's not systematic understanding, but a collection of associations and beliefs formed by accident rather than reason. Imagination produces the most inadequate ideas and leads to the most passive emotions. When we know things only through imagination, we don't understand their true causes or necessary connections. We form associations based on contingent experiences, generalizing from limited exposure, accepting beliefs on authority without rational examination. The second kind is reason, ratio, knowledge of common notions and adequate ideas of properties of things. This is scientific, rational knowledge that understands things through their causes and necessary properties. At this level, we begin to be active rather than passive, understanding rather than merely imagining. Reason grasps universal truths, laws governing all things. It understands that all bodies obey the same physical principles, that all minds follow the same psychological patterns. It recognizes necessary connections, seeing how effects follow from causes. This knowledge is adequate because it comprehends things through their essential nature rather than accidental features. The third and highest kind is intuitive knowledge, scientia intuitiva, direct intellectual perception of individual things as flowing necessarily from God's eternal nature. This isn't abstract conceptual knowledge, but immediate insight into the necessity and eternity of particular things as expressions of infinite substance. Intuitive knowledge sees individual things sub specie eternitatis, under the aspect of eternity. It grasps how this particular thing, this unique modification of substance, follows necessarily from God's nature. It combines reason's understanding of universal necessity with direct insight into individual particularity. As we ascend through these levels of knowledge, we become more free. Imagination makes us passive, subject to emotions arising from confused ideas. Reason makes us more active, able to understand and moderate our emotions. Intuitive knowledge makes us most active, seeing everything sub specie eternitatis, under the aspect of eternity, as necessary expressions of God's nature. This highest knowledge produces what Spinoza calls the intellectual love of God, amor Dei intellectualis. This isn't emotional attachment or devotion in the religious sense. It's the joy that arises from understanding God's nature, from grasping the rational necessity of all things, from seeing ourselves and everything else as eternal modifications of infinite substance. In Proposition 32 of Part 5, Spinoza demonstrates, Whatever we understand by the third kind of knowledge we take pleasure in, and this pleasure is accompanied by the idea of God as its cause. The joy arising from intuitive knowledge is necessarily accompanied by awareness of God as the source of all understanding and all being. This joy, combined with awareness of God, is intellectual love. This intellectual love is itself eternal. When we understand things under the aspect of eternity, when we grasp them as necessary expressions of God's nature, we're thinking God's own thoughts, participating in divine understanding. The mind, to the extent it understands adequately, to that extent it's an eternal mode of thinking that's an expression of God's infinite intellect. This is Spinoza's version of immortality. Not personal survival after death, not continued existence of individual consciousness, but the eternality of adequate understanding itself. The ideas we form through reason and intuitive knowledge are eternal truths, parts of God's infinite intellect. When we think these thoughts, we're participating in something eternal. In Proposition 23 of Part 5, Spinoza argues, the human mind can't be absolutely destroyed with the body, but something of it remains, which is eternal. What remains eternal isn't our individual personality, our memories, our particular identity, but the adequate ideas we've formed, the truths we've understood. The more we understand adequately, the more we consist of eternal ideas, the greater is the part of us that's eternal. This doesn't mean our individual personality or memories survive death. The body dies, and with it goes the imagination, and all ideas dependent on bodily states, including personal memories and individual characteristics. But the adequate ideas, the rational and intuitive knowledge, these are eternal aspects of God's infinite thinking. This might seem like cold comfort compared to traditional religious promises of personal immortality. But Spinoza argues it's the only kind of immortality that makes sense. Individual personality is bound to the body, to particular memories and experiences. These are finite, temporary, necessarily perishing. But truth is eternal. Adequate understanding is eternal. And to the extent we consist of adequate understanding, to that extent, we're eternal. The person who achieves intuitive knowledge, who sees all things as necessary expressions of God's nature, experiences the highest human blessedness. This person is free in the only way finite beings can be free, acting from adequate understanding rather than being driven by confused emotions and external causes. This person experiences continuous intellectual love of God, the joy arising from understanding reality's rational structure. This is Spinoza's vision of salvation, completely naturalized, requiring no supernatural intervention, no divine grace in the traditional sense, no faith in revealed doctrines. Salvation is understanding. Freedom is adequate knowledge. Blessedness is intellectual love. All of it achievable through reason alone, available to anyone willing to do the difficult work of philosophical comprehension. But Spinoza's realistic about how difficult this achievement is. The path of reason is hard. Most people remain trapped in imagination, driven by passive emotions, never achieving genuine freedom. The wise person is rare, and even the wise person can't completely escape being affected by external causes, can't achieve perfect freedom while remaining a finite mode. Yet even partial progress toward adequate understanding is worthwhile. Even moderate increase in rational knowledge brings increased freedom and joy. The ethics itself is designed to help readers achieve this understanding, to move them from imagination toward reason, to show them the rational necessity of all things, and thereby liberate them from bondage to passive emotions. The final propositions of the ethics describe the wise person's character. Such a person isn't disturbed by passive emotions because adequate understanding moderates them. Such a person acts from virtue, which is nothing other than acting according to the laws of one's own nature understood through reason. Such a person is truly free because acting from understanding rather than external compulsion. And such a person is happy, experiencing the deep joy that comes from understanding, the intellectual love that arises from grasping the necessity and interconnection of all things in God or nature. This is the highest human achievement, the goal toward which the entire ethics guides its readers. The famous last proposition of the ethics, Proposition 42 of Part 5, declares, "Blessedness isn't the reward of virtue, but virtue itself. Nor do we enjoy blessedness because we restrain our lusts. On the contrary, because we enjoy blessedness, we're able to restrain them." This inverts conventional morality. We don't become virtuous through effort and self-denial in order to earn happiness as a reward. Rather, understanding itself is virtue, and the joy arising from understanding naturally moderates destructive desires. The very last scholium, the final words of the ethics, acknowledge the difficulty of the path while insisting on its value. All things excellent are as difficult as they're rare. Spinoza knows that few will achieve the freedom and blessedness he describes, but for those who do, the reward is incomparable. True freedom, genuine joy, participation in eternal truth, intellectual love of God or nature. This conclusion brings the geometric demonstrations full circle. We began with definitions and axioms about substance and attributes. Through rigorous logical demonstration, we've arrived at a vision of human flourishing based entirely on understanding. The same necessity that governs all nature can liberate us when we comprehend it adequately. The same determinism that seems to threaten freedom actually makes freedom possible by being rationally intelligible. Part 6. The Theological-political treatise and religious freedom. While Spinoza was working on the ethics, he took time to write another major work, the Theological-political treatise, published anonymously in 1670. This book addressed practical political questions about religious authority, freedom of thought, and the relationship between philosophy and theology. It became even more controversial than the ethics, provoking outrage from religious authorities and being banned in multiple jurisdictions. The treatise begins with a radical reinterpretation of biblical prophecy and revelation. Spinoza argues that prophets weren't philosophers or scientists with special knowledge about the nature of reality. They were people with vivid imaginations and strong moral convictions who expressed their ethical teachings through imaginative visions adapted to their audience's capacity to understand. The authority of prophets comes not from theoretical knowledge, but from moral teaching. Moses, Isaiah, Jesus, they taught justice, charity, love of neighbor. These moral teachings are valuable and can help people live better lives, but they're not metaphysical truths about the nature of God or reality. They're practical wisdom expressed in imaginative, metaphorical language suited to ordinary people who can't follow abstract philosophical reasoning. Scripture, Spinoza argues, should be interpreted historically, understanding what the original authors meant in their historical context, rather than reading philosophical doctrines into texts that don't contain them. Most of the Bible is concerned with moral and political guidance for ancient Israel, not with metaphysical speculation. Reading it as philosophy leads to absurd interpretations and unwarranted dogmatic claims. Spinoza develops a sophisticated method of biblical interpretation that anticipates modern historical critical scholarship. He examines the language, historical context, authorship, and purposes of biblical texts. He shows that many traditional beliefs about Scripture, like Mosaic authorship of the entire Pentateuch, can't be sustained by careful textual analysis. For instance, he points out that the Pentateuch contains passages that couldn't have been written by Moses, such as accounts of events after Moses' death and references to Moses in the third person. He argues that these books were compiled by later editors from multiple sources. This was scandalous in his time, but has been confirmed by modern biblical scholarship. The purpose of Scripture is practical: to teach obedience to moral law, to promote justice and charity. It achieves this purpose through narratives, parables, and commandments suited to ordinary understanding. Demanding that people believe particular theological doctrines beyond these basic moral teachings is unnecessary and harmful. This distinction between philosophy and theology, between reason and faith, serves Spinoza's larger political purpose, arguing for freedom of thought and expression. Philosophy addresses truth through reason and is accessible only to those capable of abstract thought. Theology addresses piety through imagination and moral teaching and is accessible to everyone. These two domains don't conflict because they have different purposes and methods. Philosophy seeks truth through rational demonstration. Theology seeks obedience through moral persuasion. Neither should dictate to the other. Philosophers should be free to pursue truth through reason without religious interference. Religious authorities should focus on moral teaching without making dogmatic claims about metaphysical matters beyond their competence. This separation serves political freedom. The state has legitimate interest in maintaining public order and moral behavior. It can enforce laws against murder, theft, and other harmful actions. But it has no legitimate authority over people's thoughts or beliefs. Freedom of thought is absolute, inalienable, impossible to suppress completely, even if attempted. Moreover, attempting to suppress freedom of thought is counterproductive. It doesn't eliminate heterodox ideas, but drives them underground while breeding resentment and hypocrisy. People forced to hide their true beliefs become adept at deception, outwardly conforming while inwardly dissenting. This produces a society of liars rather than genuine believers. True piety doesn't require uniform belief in theological doctrines. It requires only commitment to basic moral principles: justice, charity, love of neighbor. People can hold widely different metaphysical beliefs while agreeing on these practical moral commitments. The state should enforce moral behavior while allowing complete freedom of thought and belief. Spinoza's arguing for a secular state that protects religious freedom by refusing to enforce theological orthodoxy. This was revolutionary in 17th century Europe, where religious uniformity was considered essential to political stability and where heresy was still punishable by death in many jurisdictions. The treatise also contains a sophisticated analysis of political authority and the social contract. Spinoza argues that political authority derives from the collective power of citizens who transfer their individual right to the state in exchange for protection and the benefits of organized society. The state's legitimacy depends on serving the common good, protecting citizens' rights and freedom. But the social contract doesn't and can't transfer freedom of thought. This remains inalienable because it can't be genuinely given away. I might promise to believe certain things, but I can't actually control what I believe through will alone. Thought is free by nature, and any attempt to control it through coercion produces only outward conformity masking inner dissent. Therefore, the wise state protects freedom of thought and expression, allowing citizens to think and speak freely on all matters while maintaining order through laws against harmful actions. This produces a more stable, prosperous, and genuinely pious society than attempts at enforced orthodoxy. Spinoza draws these political conclusions from his metaphysical system. If everything happens by necessity, if human actions are determined by prior causes, then persecution for heterodox beliefs is irrational. People can't help believing what seems true to them, given their nature and circumstances. Punishing them for beliefs they can't control is pointless cruelty. Moreover, if adequate understanding is the path to human flourishing, then freedom to pursue truth through reason is essential to human welfare. Suppressing philosophical inquiry harms both individuals and society by preventing the development of adequate ideas that could enhance human power and joy. The treatise's final chapters defend democracy as the most natural form of government because it comes closest to preserving the natural freedom people had before forming society. In democracy, citizens collectively exercise the authority they've transferred to the state, participating in governance rather than submitting to rulers whose interests might diverge from the common good. Spinoza's defense of democracy rests on both theoretical and practical grounds. Theoretically, it's the form of government that most respects human dignity and rational capacity. Practically, it's more stable because it gives citizens stake in maintaining order and allows peaceful resolution of conflicts through deliberation rather than violence. The treatise provoked immediate and fierce opposition. Religious authorities, both Protestant and Catholic, condemned it as blasphemous. The Dutch Reformed Church pressured political authorities to ban it. Within a few years, it was forbidden throughout the Netherlands and in most other European countries. Spinoza was attacked as an atheist, trying to undermine all religion and morality. Even sympathetic readers often published criticisms to protect themselves from association with such dangerous ideas. Yet the book's influence proved profound and lasting. Its arguments for religious toleration, freedom of thought, and separation of church and state would influence Enlightenment political philosophy and eventually shape liberal democratic theory. Its historical critical method of biblical interpretation anticipated modern biblical scholarship. Its naturalistic explanation of prophecy and revelation challenged traditional understandings of religious authority. The treatise shows Spinoza applying his philosophical principles to practical political questions. The same naturalism, rationalism, and commitment to freedom through understanding that characterize the ethics shape his political philosophy. And the same willingness to follow reason wherever it leads, regardless of conventional opinion or religious orthodoxy, makes his political conclusions as radical as his metaphysics. One of the most interesting aspects of the treatise is how it balances critique of traditional religion with respect for its practical moral value. Spinoza doesn't simply dismiss religion as superstition. He recognizes that for most people, who can't or won't pursue philosophical understanding, religious teaching provides valuable moral guidance. The problem arises when religious authorities overstep their proper domain, making metaphysical claims they can't support and persecuting those who disagree. This nuanced position allows Spinoza to advocate religious freedom while maintaining that philosophy has access to deeper truth than theology. Religion serves the masses through moral teaching adapted to ordinary understanding. Philosophy serves those capable of rational demonstration by revealing reality's true structure. Both have their place. Neither should dominate the other, and the state should protect both while identifying with neither. Part 7. The Final Years and Enduring Legacy. After the Theological-political treatise's publication in 1670, Spinoza lived only 7 more years. These final years were spent working on the ethics, corresponding with other philosophers and scientists, and occasionally writing shorter pieces on particular topics. He lived simply, grinding lenses to support himself, renting modest rooms in The Hague, refusing offers of prestigious academic positions that would have required compromising his principles. In 1673, Spinoza received an invitation from the Elector Palatine to become professor of philosophy at the University of Heidelberg. The offer was attractive in many ways, promising financial security and intellectual community. But it came with a condition: that Spinoza wouldn't disturb the publicly established religion. He declined politely, explaining that he didn't know within what limits his freedom of philosophizing would have to be confined to avoid appearing to disturb the established religion. His commitment to following reason wherever it led couldn't be reconciled with such restrictions. His health, never robust, was declining. The dust from lens grinding, inhaled daily for years, was damaging his lungs. He suffered from what was probably tuberculosis or silicosis, developing a chronic cough and breathing difficulties. He knew he'd die young, but continued working, determined to complete the ethics before his death. Visitors who met Spinoza in these final years describe a gentle, modest man of simple habits and cheerful disposition. He'd discuss philosophy with remarkable clarity and patience. He'd play games and engage in ordinary conversation. He showed no bitterness about his excommunication or the persecution his ideas faced. He seemed at peace, practicing the emotional equanimity his philosophy recommended. Leibniz visited Spinoza in November 1676, spending several days discussing philosophy. Leibniz later denied the meeting's importance, perhaps because Spinoza's reputation was so toxic that mere association was dangerous. But he'd clearly been influenced by Spinoza's ideas, even as he developed his own very different metaphysical system. In February 1677, at age 44, Spinoza died. His friends found the ethics among his papers, carefully prepared for publication, though not yet released during his lifetime. They arranged for it to be published later that year under the title Opera Posthuma, together with other unfinished works, including the political treatise and his correspondence. The Ethics appeared without Spinoza's name, identified only as written by BDS, but everyone knew who'd authored it, and the reaction was swift and harsh. Religious authorities condemned it. Governments banned it. Critics attacked it as atheism, disguised as philosophy, as a dangerous assault on religion and morality. For decades, owning Spinoza's works was risky. Reading them was considered evidence of dangerous freethinking. His ideas circulated underground, whispered about, condemned publicly, while being studied privately by those brave or curious enough to engage with them. Yet slowly, Spinoza's influence grew. Enlightenment thinkers, even those who rejected his conclusions, had to reckon with his arguments. His naturalism, his rationalism, his critique of religious authority, his arguments for political freedom, all these influenced the development of modern philosophy and political theory. In Germany, Lessing and Mendelssohn engaged seriously with Spinoza's philosophy in the 1780s, beginning a rehabilitation that had continued through German idealism. Goethe read Spinoza and found in him a kindred spirit, someone who understood nature's unity and divinity. The Romantics, despite their critique of rationalism, often drew on Spinozistic themes about nature and infinity. By the 19th century, Spinoza was being reconsidered as a major figure rather than just a dangerous heretic. Hegel incorporated him into the history of philosophy as an important step toward absolute idealism, though Hegel thought Spinoza's system was too static, lacking the dynamism of dialectical development. Marx, though critical of Spinoza's ahistorical approach, recognized his significance for materialist philosophy. Nietzsche, who shared little of Spinoza's rationalism, nonetheless felt deep affinity with him as a fellow thinker who'd followed reason courageously wherever it led. He called Spinoza his precursor and praised his intellectual integrity and amor fati, love of fate, which resonated with Spinoza's acceptance of necessity. The 20th century saw Spinoza's scholarship flourish. Analytic philosophers studied his arguments about substance, attributes, and mind-body relations. Continental philosophers explored his theory of affects and power. Political theorists examined his account of democracy and freedom. Cognitive scientists found resources in his psychology. Contemporary philosophers approached Spinoza from numerous angles. Some emphasize his metaphysical monism and its implications for understanding consciousness. Others focus on his naturalistic ethics and what it means for contemporary moral theory. Still others mine his political philosophy for insights about democracy, freedom, and multiculturalism. Part of Spinoza's enduring appeal is his systematic comprehensiveness. He doesn't address isolated questions, but develops an integrated vision encompassing metaphysics, epistemology, psychology, ethics, and politics, all derived from basic principles through rigorous demonstration. Reading Spinoza means encountering a complete worldview, not just a collection of arguments about particular topics. Another source of appeal is his uncompromising rationalism. Spinoza follows reason wherever it leads, accepting conclusions, however radical, never softening arguments to accommodate conventional opinion or religious orthodoxy. This intellectual courage, combined with his personal integrity in living according to his principles despite persecution, makes him philosophically and personally admirable. His naturalism resonates with scientific worldviews. Unlike dualists who posit supernatural realms, Spinoza offers a philosophy fully compatible with naturalistic explanation. Everything is part of one substance, subject to rational laws, explicable through natural causes. This appeals to those seeking philosophical frameworks that integrate with rather than oppose scientific understanding. His analysis of emotions and path to freedom speaks to perennial human concerns about how to live well. Whether or not we accept his metaphysics, his psychological insights about how inadequate ideas produce suffering and how understanding brings freedom remain valuable. The ethics can be read as self-help for intellectuals, offering a rational therapy for emotional bondage. His political philosophy addresses ongoing questions about religious freedom, toleration, and democratic governance. His arguments for separating theology and philosophy, protecting freedom of thought, and grounding political authority in common welfare remain relevant to contemporary debates about pluralism and liberal democracy. Perhaps most fundamentally, Spinoza offers a vision of meaning and value within a completely naturalistic, deterministic framework. He shows how to affirm life, find joy, achieve freedom, and experience something like salvation without appealing to supernatural intervention, divine providence, or personal immortality. For those who can't accept traditional religious worldviews but still seek meaning and purpose, Spinoza offers a compelling alternative. His philosophy also models how to maintain ethical commitment while embracing determinism. Critics often argue that determinism undermines morality, that if we can't choose otherwise, moral responsibility collapses. Spinoza shows this isn't true. We can recognize that actions are determined while still distinguishing better from worse, still seeking to increase understanding and power, still striving for freedom through adequate knowledge. The intellectual love of God that Spinoza describes as the highest human achievement might seem cold compared to personal relationship with a caring deity. But for many, it offers something deeper: participation in eternal truth, understanding of reality's rational structure, harmony with nature's necessity. This isn't emotional warmth, but intellectual joy, not personal salvation, but impersonal wisdom. Spinoza's life and death embody his philosophy. Excommunicated, persecuted, living in poverty, dying young, he maintained equanimity and continued pursuing truth through reason. He didn't seek revenge on those who'd cast him out. He didn't compromise his principles for comfort or safety. He lived according to his conviction that understanding itself is the highest good and source of genuine freedom. His influence continues growing rather than diminishing. New interpretations keep appearing. New applications to contemporary problems keep emerging. His philosophy remains alive, still challenging, still inspiring, still offering resources for understanding ourselves and our place in nature. For someone condemned as the most dangerous man in Europe, whose books were banned and burned, who died in obscurity and poverty, Spinoza achieved a remarkable posthumous vindication. Not that his philosophy has been universally accepted. Far from it. His ideas remain controversial and contested. But he's recognized as one of the great philosophers. His system studied seriously, his arguments engaged respectfully, his life admired. The young man, excommunicated by his community, cast out into isolation, choosing truth over belonging, following reason despite persecution. This young man produced one of the most systematic, comprehensive, and enduring philosophical visions in Western thought. His life proved that one person, armed with reason and integrity, can challenge established authority and offer alternatives that reshape how we understand reality, knowledge, freedom, and the good life. Part 8. Spinoza and Contemporary Life. What does Spinoza offer people living in the 21st century, centuries removed from his time, in a world he couldn't have imagined? Why should we still read this excommunicated lens grinder who wrote in geometrical demonstrations about substance and attributes? The answers are numerous and increasingly relevant as we face challenges Spinoza never confronted, but that his philosophy helps us navigate. Start with environmental crisis. Spinoza's identification of God with nature provides a philosophical foundation for ecological consciousness. If nature isn't merely creation to be used, but is itself divine, expressing infinite substance in infinite ways, then our relationship to the natural world must be one of reverence rather than exploitation. Spinoza's holism, his insistence that everything is interconnected as modifications of one substance, resonates with ecological understanding of how human actions ripple through complex systems. We're not separate from nature, but parts of it, and damaging natural systems ultimately damages ourselves because we're intrinsically connected to the whole. His naturalism also helps us accept our place in nature, rather than seeing ourselves as separate, superior beings entitled to dominate. We're finite modes, like everything else, subject to natural laws, dependent on the systems that sustain us. This perspective supports environmental humility and responsibility. The deep ecology movement has drawn explicitly on Spinoza, recognizing in his philosophy a vision of nature's intrinsic value and interconnection. When we see forests, rivers, and ecosystems as expressions of divine substance rather than mere resources for human use, we develop the reverence and care that ecological survival requires. Consider mental health and emotional well-being. Spinoza's analysis of emotions as modifications of our power of acting, his account of how inadequate ideas produce passive emotions that diminish us, his prescription of understanding as the path to emotional freedom, all this anticipates and supports cognitive approaches to mental health. Modern cognitive therapy recognizes that emotional problems often stem from distorted thinking patterns, from beliefs that don't match reality. Changing these beliefs, developing more accurate understanding, produces emotional improvement. This is essentially Spinozistic therapy, replacing inadequate ideas with adequate ones to transform passive emotions into active understanding. His emphasis on self-knowledge, on understanding our own nature and genuine good, supports therapeutic practices focused on self-awareness and authentic living. His recognition that we can't directly control emotions, but can influence them through understanding, provides realistic expectations for emotional regulation. The contemporary mindfulness movement, though drawing mainly from Buddhist traditions, shares Spinoza's emphasis on understanding as liberating. Both recognize that suffering arises from confused thinking and that clear awareness of reality reduces suffering. Both advocate accepting what is rather than struggling against necessity. Think about living with determinism. Many people find determinism depressing, thinking it makes life meaningless or undermines moral responsibility. Spinoza shows how to embrace determinism while maintaining ethical commitment and finding meaning. Everything happens necessarily, yes, but this necessity is rational, understandable, part of the eternal structure of reality. We can't change what must necessarily be, but we can understand it, and this understanding itself is liberating. We can't have freedom from causation, but we can achieve freedom through understanding, acting from adequate knowledge of our nature, rather than being driven by confused emotions and external compulsion. His vision of meaning within determinism is especially valuable in an age when scientific understanding reveals how much of our behavior is influenced by genetics, neurobiology, social conditioning. Accepting these influences while still pursuing understanding and striving for greater adequacy of ideas provides a path between fatalism and naive belief in unlimited free will. Consider political polarization and ideological conflict. Spinoza's distinction between philosophy and theology, between rational pursuit of truth and imaginative moral teaching, helps us understand why people can have such different worldviews while still sharing basic ethical commitments. People might disagree profoundly about metaphysics, religion, politics, yet still agree on fundamental moral principles. Don't harm others, help those in need, treat people fairly. Spinoza suggests we should protect freedom of thought while focusing on shared ethical ground rather than demanding ideological uniformity. His arguments for toleration remain urgent. In a pluralistic society containing people with radically different beliefs, the attempt to enforce orthodoxy produces conflict and hypocrisy. Better to protect freedom of thought and expression while maintaining social order through laws against harmful actions. Think about technology and artificial intelligence. Spinoza's psychophysical parallelism, his view that mind and body are the same thing conceived through different attributes, provides an interesting framework for thinking about machine consciousness. If consciousness is fundamentally about information processing and self-representation, if it's not tied to biological substrate but to certain kinds of organization, then artificial consciousness might be possible. His naturalism helps us avoid mystifying consciousness or treating it as necessarily tied to carbon-based biology. If mind is an attribute of substance, if it's present wherever there's organization and complexity, then perhaps sufficiently complex artificial systems could instantiate mental states. His determinism also applies to artificial intelligence. These systems operate according to their programming and the data they process, determined by their design and inputs. Understanding how they work, what determines their outputs, is essential for using them wisely and ethically. Consider questions about identity and authenticity. Spinoza's account of the self as a finite mode with both mental and physical aspects, his emphasis on self-knowledge and acting from one's own nature, speaks to contemporary concerns about authentic living. We're not fixed, unchanging souls, but dynamic processes, modifications of substance constantly affected by circumstances. Yet we have a nature, a conatus, a striving to persist and enhance our being. Living authentically means understanding this nature and acting in ways that express it rather than merely responding to external pressures. His recognition that we're social beings, necessarily affected by our relationships and communities, balances individualism with acknowledgement of our essential connectedness. We can't be completely independent, can't escape being influenced by others, but we can strive to understand these influences and respond to them more actively rather than passively. Think about mortality and the desire for immortality. Spinoza's account of eternity, of how adequate ideas participate in God's infinite intellect, offers an alternative to traditional religious promises of personal survival. We won't continue as individual personalities, but the truths we understand, the adequate ideas we form, these are eternal aspects of infinite substance. This might seem insufficient consolation to those hoping for personal continuance, but it offers something perhaps more profound: the recognition that participating in truth, understanding reality adequately, connects us to something eternal, even though our particular existence is temporary. His emphasis on present flourishing rather than future salvation is also valuable. The goal isn't to earn reward after death, but to achieve understanding and freedom now, in this life, through developing adequate knowledge. This focuses attention on actual living rather than deferred hope. Consider scientific understanding and its limits. Spinoza's rationalism, his confidence that reality is fundamentally intelligible, supports scientific inquiry. But his recognition of different kinds of knowledge, his distinction between reason, general principles, and intuitive knowledge, direct insight into particulars, suggests limits to purely abstract scientific understanding. We can understand general laws and principles through scientific reason, but the direct intuitive grasp of particular things in their eternal necessity, seeing them as unique expressions of infinite substance, requires a different kind of knowing. This complements scientific understanding rather than replacing it. His naturalism also supports scientific realism while avoiding reductive materialism. Everything is natural. Everything is part of one substance. But substance has infinite attributes, not just extension. Mind isn't reducible to matter because they're different attributes of the same substance. This allows genuine physicalism without eliminative reduction. Think about community and isolation. Spinoza lived most of his life in isolation after excommunication. Yet his philosophy emphasizes how we're necessarily connected to others, how our power is enhanced through cooperation and community. The tension between his solitary life and his social philosophy reflects genuine difficulties in balancing independence and connection. His emphasis on freedom through understanding could lead to solipsistic withdrawal, focusing only on one's own intellectual development. But his recognition that we're parts of nature necessarily affected by other parts, that our power is enhanced through beneficial relationships, points toward engaged participation in community. The intellectual love of God he describes needn't be solitary. Shared understanding, philosophical community, collective pursuit of truth, these can embody the active joy of adequate knowledge while connecting us to others. Consider inequality and justice. Spinoza's recognition that people differ in their capacity for adequate understanding, that most remain trapped in imagination, while few achieve reason and intuitive knowledge, seems elitist. But his insistence that everyone can improve, that understanding is accessible to anyone willing to pursue it, is more democratic. His political philosophy emphasizes that the state should protect everyone's freedom and promote common welfare, not just serve elite interests. His naturalism makes him suspicious of hierarchies based on supposed natural superiority. We're all finite modes, all subject to the same laws, all striving to persist in our being. His ethics doesn't require special revelation or adherence to particular traditions. It's based on reason, potentially accessible to anyone. This universalism supports egalitarian moral and political commitments, even while recognizing that people achieve different levels of understanding. Think about addiction and compulsive behavior. Spinoza's account of how passive emotions arising from inadequate ideas diminish our power and make us passive helps explain addictive patterns. We're driven by desires we don't fully understand, seeking things that don't genuinely enhance us, trapped in cycles that diminish our power of acting. Recovery involves developing adequate understanding of what we're really seeking, what genuinely benefits us, what our true nature requires. This isn't about willpower overcoming temptation, but about understanding replacing confusion. Adequate ideas, transforming passive emotions into active understanding. His recognition that we can't directly control desires, but can influence them through changing our ideas, provides realistic expectations. We can't simply will ourselves to stop wanting harmful things. but we can develop understanding that gradually transforms the quality of our desires. Finally, consider the search for meaning in a secular age. Many people today can't accept traditional religious worldviews, but still seek something beyond material success and pleasure. Spinoza offers a completely naturalistic path to meaning, freedom, and something like salvation. The intellectual love of God, the joy arising from understanding reality's rational structure, the freedom achieved through adequate knowledge, the eternity of truth, all this provides meaning within a naturalistic framework. We don't need supernatural intervention or personal deity to find purpose and value. Understanding itself is valuable. Truth itself is eternal. Knowledge itself is liberating. This vision appeals to those seeking meaning without mythology, spirituality without supernaturalism, ethical commitment without divine commands. Spinoza shows how to affirm life, pursue excellence, achieve freedom, and participate in something eternal while accepting a completely naturalistic, deterministic worldview. His philosophy remains challenging, demanding, uncompromising. He asks us to accept difficult truths, that we're not free in the way we imagine, that everything happens by necessity, that most of what we desire won't genuinely benefit us. But he also offers profound hope, that understanding is possible, that freedom through knowledge is achievable, that we can participate in eternal truth even though our particular existence is temporary. For those willing to do the difficult work of philosophical comprehension, willing to question conventional beliefs, willing to follow reason wherever it leads, Spinoza offers a comprehensive vision of reality, knowledge, freedom, and flourishing that remains as relevant and challenging today as when he first conceived it in his solitary rooms while grinding lenses in 17th century Holland. The excommunicated heretic, the condemned atheist, the dangerous freethinker, turned out to be one of humanity's great teachers, offering wisdom about how to live well, think clearly, and find freedom through understanding. His voice, silenced by excommunication, suppressed by censorship, speaks more clearly now than ever, inviting us to undertake the same journey toward adequate knowledge and intellectual love that he mapped out with such systematic rigor and philosophical courage. That journey begins with a simple but profound question. Am I willing to follow reason wherever it leads? To accept what understanding reveals, even when it contradicts comfortable beliefs? To seek truth rather than consolation? If the answer is yes, then Spinoza has much to teach. If the answer is no, then perhaps it's worth asking why. What we're afraid of discovering? What beliefs we're protecting from rational examination? The geometric demonstrations of the ethics await those courageous enough to engage them. The intellectual love of God beckons those willing to pursue understanding. The freedom that comes from adequate knowledge remains available to anyone who'll do the difficult work of achieving it. Spinoza's philosophy, like the eternal truths it seeks to comprehend, remains timelessly relevant, perpetually challenging, endlessly rewarding for those who engage it seriously and follow where it leads. In our age of information, overload, and shallow engagement, Spinoza's demand for deep understanding, rigorous demonstration, and intellectual integrity stands as a reproach and an invitation. We can't achieve understanding through sound bites, memes, or shallow browsing. We must do the hard work of following arguments, grasping connections, thinking through implications. But for those willing to make the effort, the reward is nothing less than freedom, joy, and participation in eternal truth. The lens grinder from Amsterdam, working in solitude, creating precision instruments while contemplating the infinite, offers us tools for understanding ourselves and our world that remain as sharp and clear as the lenses he crafted. His vision of God or nature, of mind and body united in one substance, of freedom through understanding, continues to illuminate paths toward wisdom and flourishing for anyone brave enough to walk them. And perhaps that's Spinoza's greatest legacy. Not a completed system that answers all questions, but an invitation to think deeply, live authentically, and find freedom through understanding. The questions he raised about God, nature, freedom, and human flourishing remain urgent. The methods he employed, rigorous reasoning and systematic demonstration, remain essential. The goal he pursued, adequate understanding that liberates and fulfills, remains as worthwhile now as when he dedicated his brief life to achieving it. His story reminds us that one person, armed with reason and integrity, can challenge the deepest assumptions of their age and offer visions of reality that transform how humanity understands itself. That the pursuit of truth, even when it leads to exile and persecution, is worth the cost. That understanding itself is the highest human good, source of freedom, joy, and whatever immortality finite beings can achieve. The ethics ends with those famous words, "All things excellent are as difficult as they're rare." The path Spinoza maps is difficult. Few will follow it completely, but even partial progress brings genuine benefit. Even modest increase in understanding enhances freedom and joy. The journey itself is worthwhile, even if we never reach the final destination. So let's honor Spinoza, not just by studying his arguments, but by embracing his spirit, the courage to question, the commitment to reason, the determination to understand, the willingness to accept what truth reveals, however uncomfortable. In doing so, we keep alive the vision of that young man who chose truth over community, reason over tradition, understanding over obedience, and in the process created one of the most profound and liberating philosophies humanity has produced.